Imagine the year is 1859. The Utah desert stretches endlessly, its red cliffs and barren valleys swallowing secrets as quickly as it swallows the footsteps of travelers. Among the settlers who carved out lives in this harsh landscape were the Mormons, followers of a new and controversial faith that promised eternal family bonds and divine covenants. But hidden beneath the promise of paradise on earth was a darker, more secretive story. This was a world where faith demanded absolute loyalty, where leaders held power not only over men's souls, but also over women's lives. And in this world, whispers began to circulate, whispers of wives who had been taken in silence, bound by secret covenants, and later eliminated when they dared to break the rules. These were not tales spoken in the daylight. They were murmured at campfires, retold by passing travelers, or written in coded words in private diaries. The year 1859 was supposed to be a time of rebuilding. The Utah War, a standoff between Mormon settlers and the U.S. Army, had just ended. Brigham Young still ruled as the unquestioned patriarch of a religious kingdom in the desert, and the practice of plural marriage, what the outside world called polygamy, was in full force. Yet behind the image of unity, order, and devotion, cracks appeared. Some women fled their homes and tried to tell their stories. Others vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Were these disappearances accidents in a dangerous frontier, or was something more sinister at work? Something tied to covenants so binding that breaking them could cost you your life? The desert was not just a place of survival, it was a place of silence. In 1859, Utah was cut off from the outside world, a kingdom in the mountains where one man's word could outweigh 1,000 doubts. Brigham Young, the prophet and territorial governor, preached obedience, loyalty, and sacrifice. His followers believed they were building Zion, a holy refuge, but to maintain such a society, secrecy was essential. Polygamy was no longer a hidden whisper, it was doctrine. Leaders boasted dozens of wives, sometimes sealed in marriages performed without record, without recognition, and without the woman's full consent. Many of these covenant wives were young, barely beyond childhood, drawn in with promises of eternal salvation. But what happened to those who resisted? What of the women who whispered to outsiders, who tried to escape, who longed for the freedom that had been stripped away by spiritual contracts they never truly understood? Rumors tell of punishments that went beyond excommunication, beyond shunning. Some said women who broke the covenant were taken in the night, escorted into the desert, and never seen again. Others were said to have been buried under false names, erased from family records, their existence wiped clean as though they had never been born. These whispers were denied by leaders, dismissed as lies invented by enemies. Yet too many stories surfaced to be ignored. Each one carried the same haunting theme. Women who entered a covenant in secrecy, and when they chose to leave, they were eliminated in secrecy as well. To outsiders, Utah in 1859 was already a place of mystery and unease. The U.S. government saw the Mormon settlement as a theocracy defying federal law. Soldiers, journalists, and travelers passing through told strange stories of a society ruled not by democracy, but by revelation. In taverns and camps, tales spread of lost wives, women who disappeared after entering marriages that were never listed on paper. Some described wagon trails where shallow graves marked only with stones were found, graves said to belong to runaway wives who had been hunted down. Others spoke of the doctrine of blood atonement, a teaching, never officially admitted, that suggested some sins were so grave they required the sinner's own blood to be spilled to achieve forgiveness. If such a teaching were true, could it have been applied to women who broke the covenant? Whether fact or folklore, these stories chilled those who heard them. Imagine the terror of a young woman who discovered she had been sealed as a secret wife to a powerful leader. Imagine realizing that if you spoke, if you fled, there might be no escape. The walls of the desert became a prison, the silence of the community a weapon. For some, obedience meant survival. For others, silence meant death. And still, the leaders stood firm, declaring their innocence, proclaiming that enemies had twisted their sacred practices into horror stories. But if that were true, why did so many women vanish, leaving no records, no graves, no voices to defend themselves? By the close of 1859, Utah stood at a crossroads. To the faithful, it was Zion, a holy city rising from dust and stone. To the critics, it was a fortress of secrecy, built on obedience and hidden sins. And to the women at the heart of it all, it was a place of impossible choices. Remain silent and endure, or speak out and risk being erased. These vanished wives became phantoms of history, their stories left half-told, their names lost to fire, wind, and deliberate omission. Were they truly eliminated by covenant, sacrifice to preserve the unity of a faith under siege? Or were their disappearances the tragedies of an unforgiving frontier? Accidents twisted by rumor into tales of blood and vengeance? The truth lies buried in diaries locked away, in oral histories passed down in secret, and in the uncomfortable questions that the official records refuse to answer. What happened in 1859 was more than a clash of government and religion. It was a battle over memory itself, over who gets to tell the story and who gets forgotten. As we look back into the shadows of Utah's past, one question remains. How many lives were erased to protect the covenant, and how many voices will never be heard again? This is the hidden story of the secret wives of 1859. Wives who entered a promise of eternity, and instead found themselves lost in silence, their fate swallowed by the desert. To understand the dark whispers of 1859 Utah, we first need to trace how the Mormon faith and its controversial practices arrived in the desert in the first place. The story begins in the 1820s, in upstate New York, where a young man named Joseph Smith claimed to have visions of an angel who directed him to golden plates, which he translated into the Book of Mormon. His teachings promised a restored Christianity, one that gave divine authority back to prophets and apostles. But from the very beginning, this movement clashed with mainstream America. The new church's tight-knit communities, radical theology, and claims of revelation unsettled neighbors, and persecution followed wherever they went. Driven from state to state, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, the Mormons built cities only to watch them burned, destroyed, or abandoned. In Missouri, violent mobs targeted them. In Illinois, Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob in 1844 while awaiting trial. After his death, leadership passed to Brigham Young, a man both pragmatic and ruthless. He led his people westward, beyond the borders of the United States at the time, into the vast wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. In 1847, they settled in the Salt Lake Valley, a land so harsh and desolate that most outsiders thought no one could survive there. But to the Mormons, this was more than survival. It was divine destiny. By the 1850s, Utah had transformed into a theocratic kingdom under Brigham Young's iron hand. He was prophet, governor, and commander all at once. The Mormon people followed him as both spiritual father and political leader, and in this isolated society, obedience was not optional. Polygamy, or plural marriage as they called it, was revealed as a divine commandment, first practiced in secret, then openly defended as essential for salvation. Leaders claimed it was God's will for righteous men to take multiple wives, sometimes dozens. These marriages were not just earthly unions, but eternal sealings, contracts that bound women to their husbands for all eternity. But while the faithful embraced this as sacred truth, outsiders saw it as immoral, scandalous, even criminal. The U.S. government condemned polygamy as a threat to Christian values and the family structure. Journalists called Utah a den of vice, while politicians argued it was as destructive to the republic as slavery. Yet inside Utah, opposition was nearly impossible. Those who resisted risked not only their standing in the church but also their very survival in a land controlled entirely by their leaders. And for women, the stakes were higher still. Marriage was often arranged, age was no barrier, and choice was limited. Once bound in covenant, escape was nearly unthinkable. The 1850s also saw the rise of tension between the Mormon kingdom and the U.S. government. In 1857, President James Buchanan sent federal troops to Utah, fearing rebellion. This became known as the Utah War. While full-scale battles never erupted, the standoff left the territory shaken and resentful. During this period of crisis, loyalty to the church was tested like never before. Mormons believed outsiders wanted to destroy them, just as mobs had in Illinois and Missouri. This siege mentality only deepened the power of leaders like Brigham Young, who insisted that obedience and secrecy were vital to survival. Anyone who threatened unity, whether outsider or dissenter, was seen as dangerous. It was in this climate of fear and defiance that the most chilling rumors took root. If a wife fled her marriage, if a woman resisted being sealed in covenant, she wasn't just defying her husband. She was defying the church, the prophet, and God himself. And in a society where faith and law were one, such defiance carried consequences. Historians argue that this was the soil in which the idea of blood atonement grew, a belief, whispered but never fully acknowledged, that certain sins could only be forgiven if the sinner's life was taken. Whether real or imagined, this teaching cast a long, terrifying shadow over the wives trapped in covenant marriages. So by the time 1859 arrived, Utah was a land unlike any other in America. Isolated, defiant, and deeply secretive, it was governed by both faith and fear. To outsiders, it appeared as a frontier theocracy, strange, dangerous, and impenetrable. To insiders, it was the promised land, the kingdom of God on earth, built at unimaginable cost. And at the heart of this society were women, often young, often voiceless, whose lives were dictated by covenants they could not refuse and promises they could not escape. The official records of the church celebrate the sacrifices of these women, portraying them as willing participants in God's plan. But beneath those records lies another story, a story told in whispers, in rumors, and in the vanished lives of wives who did not survive the covenant. These women were not just figures of devotion. They were the victims of a system that demanded everything and offered no way out. Their disappearances, whether through violence, coercion, or deliberate erasure from memory, became the dark undercurrent of Utah's early history. And in 1859, the silence surrounding them was as vast and suffocating as the desert itself. The year 1859 unfolded in Utah with an eerie stillness. The echoes of the Utah War had barely faded. Federal troops remained stationed nearby, their presence a constant reminder that the U.S. government did not trust the Mormon kingdom. The settlers carried on with daily life, tending farms, building homes, raising children. But beneath the surface, tension hummed like a taut string. Every wagon creak, every hoofbeat in the desert could be mistaken for soldiers returning, for spies, for enemies. Fear was woven into the fabric of society, and loyalty to the church was the only shield against suspicion. In Salt Lake City, Brigham Young's influence was absolute. His sermons thundered from the pulpit, carried across valleys and canyons by word of mouth. Every decision, marriages, land disputes, punishments, flowed through the hierarchy of church authority. The people looked to him not just as a religious leader but as their judge, their governor, their general. And in such an environment, dissent was unthinkable. To question the covenant was to question the prophet himself. The atmosphere of 1859 was heavy with secrecy. Families lived in tight clusters, yet neighbors rarely interfered in one another's business. Behind the walls of modest homes and cabins, plural marriages continued to expand. Some women were celebrated publicly as wives. Others were hidden, known only to the inner circle of leaders and confidants. To outsiders, this looked like chaos. To insiders, it was a carefully managed order, where silence and obedience ensured survival. Travelers who entered Utah in 1859 often described it as stepping into another world. The desert stretched endlessly, its red rocks and white salt flats reflecting a harsh sun that seemed to scorch all secrets into the earth itself. Towns appeared suddenly, built with surprising efficiency, their streets lined with irrigation ditches and adobe homes. But the most striking feature was the unity of the people. Every man, woman, and child seemed to move in harmony, guided by a single purpose. Outsiders reported that conversations were guarded, that eyes followed them wherever they went. This suspicion was no accident. After decades of persecution, the Mormon settlers trusted few beyond their circle. Journalists who tried to probe into plural marriages often found doors slammed in their faces. Women, when asked, rarely spoke at all, their eyes dropping to the floor, their silence louder than any confession. And when whispers surfaced of women vanishing, wives who disappeared after disputes with their husbands. There were no official investigations, no public outcry. The community closed ranks, insisting that rumors were lies spread by enemies. Yet the absence of records, the missing names, and the quiet graves suggested otherwise. The air in 1859 was thick with dual realities: the proud image of Zion presented to the world, and the darker shadow life that existed behind closed doors. It was this shadow where the covenant wives lived, trapped between devotion and fear, their fates often sealed long before they realized it. It is important to imagine the emotional landscape of Utah in that year. For many women, life meant endless labor, caring for children, tending to fields, preparing food, sewing clothes. But layered onto these burdens was the constant weight of obedience. To displease a husband was to risk punishment. To displease the church was far worse. Wives in plural marriages competed for attention, for survival, and for spiritual favor. Some tried to endure silently. Others broke under the strain. When a wife disappeared, explanations were given quickly. She had gone east. She had fallen ill. She had gone to live with relatives. These words smoothed over cracks in the official narrative. Yet travelers noted how often such stories failed to match reality. Relatives back east had never seen the woman. Graves appeared with no names. And when families quietly admitted to losing daughters or sisters to secret marriages, their voices carried an edge of bitterness and fear. 1859 was also marked by the continued enforcement of covenants. Sacred promises said to bind not only in life but in eternity. For a woman to resist her covenant husband was to resist God. For her to attempt escape was, in the eyes of some leaders, a sin beyond forgiveness. In such a climate, the rumor of elimination did not sound impossible. It sounded inevitable. By the close of 1859, Utah was a land balanced on the edge of myth and reality. Outsiders saw a desert stronghold guarded by men with rifles and bound by secrecy. Insiders saw the chosen land of God, purified through sacrifice and suffering. But within this paradox, one truth remained: women bore the heaviest weight. Their lives, often hidden behind layers of secrecy, were recorded only when convenient and erased when necessary. The atmosphere was not one of open violence, but of quiet disappearance. No gunfire echoed through Salt Lake streets. No public executions shocked the world. Instead, silence reigned. A wife who vanished did so without noise, without witness, her absence absorbed by the desert and the collective will of the community. For those who survived, life carried on as though nothing had happened. The covenant was preserved, the image of unity maintained. This was the Utah of 1859, a land of stark beauty and stark terror, where faith demanded loyalty, where silence protected the community, and where the vanished wives slipped into legend. Some believed they were martyrs of obedience. Others whispered they were victims of elimination. But all agreed on one thing: once a woman disappeared into the shadows of the covenant, her voice was gone forever. In the shadowed corners of Utah's early history, few figures are as haunting as the secret wives. These women lived lives hidden from the public eye, bound not by choice but by the unyielding authority of covenant sealings. To outsiders, plural marriage was already shocking enough. But even within the Mormon community, some marriages remained deliberately unspoken, performed in secrecy, unrecorded in official ledgers, witnessed only by a handful of loyal insiders. These were the women whose names faded almost as soon as they were spoken, their lives existing in a twilight world between acknowledgement and denial. The reasons for secrecy were many. Some wives were too young, their marriages concealed until they came of age. Others were women already attached to other men, sealed in spiritual unions that could not be recognized publicly. And some were hidden for political reasons, marriages that, if exposed, might have stirred controversy or drawn unwanted attention from federal investigators. For the women themselves, secrecy meant invisibility. They could not speak openly of their unions. They could not claim their place among the community of wives. Their very existence depended on silence. Yet silence was never perfect. Travelers noticed discrepancies. Neighbors whispered about young women living in households without explanation. And occasionally, a woman would attempt to break her silence, to flee, to write, to tell the truth. It was in these moments that the veil of secrecy was most dangerous, for to defy the covenant was to invite consequences few dared to imagine. The lives of the secret wives were defined by both devotion and fear. In sermons, church leaders spoke of plural marriage as a holy principle, a sacrifice that would ensure eternal reward. Women were told that obedience would bring them closer to God, that their submission was part of the divine plan. Many endured silently, hoping their suffering would be sanctified. But beneath the surface, despair festered. Diaries smuggled out of Utah later revealed women who wept at night, praying not for eternal blessings but for escape. For those who remained hidden, life meant isolation. They rarely appeared in public gatherings. Their names were omitted from family genealogies. They raised children quietly, sometimes claiming to be boarders or distant relatives to avoid suspicion. And when they disappeared, whether by flight, coercion, or worse, there were no official records to mark their absence. The church insisted such stories were inventions of enemies. Yet even sympathetic observers admitted the pattern. Women who entered the covenant in secrecy, and when they chose to leave, vanished without a trace. In 1859, these rumors grew sharper. The war with the federal government had heightened paranoia, and leaders demanded absolute loyalty. If a wife's silence could not be trusted, she became a liability. In a society that prized obedience above all else, a disobedient wife was not just a personal problem. She was a threat to the survival of Zion itself. Whispers spread of wives who resisted and paid the ultimate price. Some stories told of women who fled into the desert, only to be pursued and brought back, their fate sealed in secret rituals of punishment. Others spoke of sudden illnesses that struck down wives who had argued with their husbands or confided in outsiders. Still others hinted at unnamed graves scattered across the desert, where women were buried under false identities, their memory erased. None of these tales were ever officially acknowledged, but they circulated persistently among travelers, ex-Mormons, and even some insiders who dared to confide in diaries or letters. The concept of blood atonement loomed over these stories. Though never formally codified, the teaching suggested that certain sins required death for forgiveness. Could breaking a covenant, fleeing a marriage bound by God, be counted among those sins? If so, then for some, eliminating a rebellious wife was not murder, but mercy twisted into violence. The church denied such practices, but the rumors were too consistent, too detailed, to be dismissed entirely. And in the fearful climate of 1859, when unity meant survival, few dared to question whether the rumors were true. What makes the story of the secret wives most chilling is not only the possibility of violence, but the certainty of erasure. These women, whether they lived or died, were stripped of identity. Their names were missing from official records, their faces absent from photographs, their children often raised under different names, their lineage quietly absorbed into the broader community. To vanish was not merely to die, it was to be unremembered. For the women themselves, the fear was constant. Imagine waking each day knowing your life depended on silence, knowing that even your family might deny your existence if commanded. Imagine realizing that if you disappeared, no one outside your covenant would even know you had lived. This was the reality of the secret wives in 1859. They were women caught in a system that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and invisibility. Their voices were hushed, their choices stripped away, their fates decided by powers far beyond their control. As the year unfolded, the stories of these women became the backbone of whispered legends. Were they victims of circumstance, of harsh frontier life, or of deliberate elimination? History offers no clear answers. What remains is their silence, an echo that lingers through time, haunting the deserts of Utah with questions that will never fully be answered. By 1859, the whispers of secret wives had hardened into chilling stories of eliminations. These were not public punishments, not spectacles of justice shouted from pulpits. They were quiet vanishings, sudden absences explained away with vague excuses. A wife who dared to question her covenant might be said to have gone east or fallen ill, A woman who resisted her husband's authority might be described as called away to another household. But those who looked closer noticed the gaps. Families who never heard from their daughters again, letters that stopped without warning, children left without mothers and no explanation given. In the tight-knit Mormon settlements, silence was both shield and weapon. Neighbors saw the absences but did not speak. Outsiders pressed for answers but were turned away. Those who dared to suggest foul play found themselves branded as liars, enemies of Zion, tools of the federal government. And yet, behind closed doors, the rumors persisted. Travelers passing through reported hearing tales of women buried in shallow graves, their names forgotten. Apostates, those who had fled the church, claimed that disobedient wives had been sacrificed under the doctrine of blood atonement. Whether truth or invention, these stories spread like wildfire, staining the reputation of the church and feeding the growing divide between Utah and the United States. The doctrine of blood atonement loomed large over these stories. Though never officially adopted into written law, it was preached in fiery sermons and whispered in private meetings. Some sins, it was said, were so grave that only the shedding of blood could cleanse them. Apostates, traitors, and oath-breakers were often cited as examples. But what about covenant wives, women bound to secrecy, who then betrayed it? For some, the logic was undeniable. If they broke their eternal promise, their sin was beyond forgiveness. Imagine the terror this teaching created for women. A wife who considered fleeing not only feared her husband's wrath, but the judgment of the entire community. If blood atonement were real, then escape was not just rebellion, it was a death sentence. And so, many stayed, trapped in silence, their fear reinforced by the disappearances of others. Even if the killings were rare, the belief alone was enough to keep countless women in line. Fear did the work of chains, binding them more tightly than iron ever could. Accounts of eliminations often followed the same unsettling pattern. A wife resists. She argues, she confides in outsiders, or she attempts to flee. Soon after, she disappears. A grave might be dug in the desert, marked only by stones. A traveler might overhear locals speaking in hushed tones of a woman who had been taken care of. Diaries from ex-Mormons recount women vanishing under mysterious circumstances, with leaders offering no explanation beyond divine will. And yet, there was never evidence, no bodies presented, no trials held. It was as though the land itself swallowed the women whole, keeping their secrets locked beneath the sand and stone. The Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857, still fresh in memory, only deepened the credibility of such rumors. If settlers could slaughter more than 100 emigrants, including women and children, at the order of leaders, was it truly unthinkable that disobedient wives might meet a quieter, hidden fate? The massacre stood as a grim reminder. In Utah, under the shadow of Brigham Young's authority, the boundaries between faith, law, and violence were dangerously thin. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these eliminations was the lack of resistance. The community itself became complicit through silence. Families who lost daughters often kept quiet, fearing retaliation or disgrace. Neighbors who suspected foul play looked the other way, unwilling to challenge the prophet or his enforcers. And the women who remained learned the lesson well. Obedience was safety, silence was survival. Historians still debate whether these eliminations were widespread reality or exaggerated folklore born of fear. But in 1859, to those living within the Mormon kingdom, the line between rumor and truth mattered little. The fear was real, and the disappearances undeniable. Every vanished wife reinforced the message. The covenant could not be broken. Those who tried would pay the ultimate price, whether at the hands of men, the desert, or the God they were told to serve. And so, the eliminations became part of Utah's hidden history, a story buried beneath faith and denial, whispered only in the darkest corners. The vanished wives did not leave behind monuments or records. They left behind only silence, and in that silence, a haunting question. How many lives were taken to preserve the covenant of Zion?